Okay, so you had to either choose to agree or disagree with the statement that Paleolithic people had an easier life, an easier time than Neolithic people did. Most of you chose to disagree with that statement and thought that Neolithic people had a much easier life than Paleolithic people did. Yes, I would agree. But how did you respond to that answer? How did you justify your opinion? I wonder what Mr. Page has to say about that. When I was grading these note cards where you wrote down your responses, why the Neolithic people had an easier time than Paleolithic people, as most of you chose, you had to include 3 vocabulary words in your response, and your response had to be written in at least 1 to 3 complete sentences. So I'm going to give you some feedback on those responses and why you did well in some cases with how you chose to respond with that question. Most often what? Tell it like it is. What happened? Most often, what did students do? Well, to tell it like it is, students did really, truly a great job. So you should be proud of yourselves. Therefore, you should be happy. Great job. I just said it 2 seconds ago. But I have to point out some things that could have been fixed, in spite of the fact that most of you got 5 out of 5, 5-point assignment, and it was a product assignment as well. So here's with constructive criticism. Number 1. You had to make sure you were talking about the correct group of people when you mentioned a detail. If you said the Neolithic people had agriculture, you were correct. But if you said the Paleolithic people had agriculture, then you made a mistake regarding which group of people did which type of thing. It was important to make sure you were correct in naming the group of people and what their lifestyle details were about. Number 2. Did you really make a decision when answering whether the statement was true or false that Paleolithic people had an easier lifestyle than Neolithic people? You can't be wishy-washy. You can't think, well, is it, no, was it, I can't commit. Oh. You gotta make a commitment. You gotta stick to one thing. Paleolithic, Neolithic. Who had the easier life? Did you actually give me an answer? In some responses, I didn't actually have a commitment from the student whether they thought that Paleolithic people had an easier lifetime than Neolithic people, or whether Neolithic people had an easier lifetime than Paleolithic people. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, in some ways the Paleolithic people had it easier. They did not have to work in as many jobs because there weren't as many jobs. In some ways the Neolithic people had it easier. They had lots of leisure time. Their jobs could have been more fun. On the other hand, maybe you would have liked having temporary shelters. Maybe you think building these large homes would have been quite a lot of work and taken a lot of time, and then you'd be prone to natural disasters coming in, perhaps outside attacks. I get it. I know. The Paleolithic lifestyle wasn't perfect, but it wasn't completely flawed. The Neolithic lifestyle, it wasn't, well, as primitive as the Paleolithic lifestyle, but really it brought its own problems too. I understand, but still, you have to commit. You have to make a choice, and you have to justify that choice in your response. Number 3. Another mistake that might have been made is your vocabulary words that you used to justify your choice or to make your response should have focused on Paleolithic people and Neolithic people. Some vocabulary words I saw were from earlier in the year, like historian, archaeologist, and geographer were vocabulary words we did have, but were they the best choices to use in a brief response in comparing Neolithic and Paleolithic people? Number 4. If the primary focus of your answer on why Neolithic people's lives were easier than Paleolithic people's lives was because Neolithic people learned how to farm, and you're assuming that that makes their lives easier than hunting and gathering, you needed to tell me why farming made their lives easier than hunting and gathering. No, it's raining on my crops. Ah! You see what I'm saying? Maybe those thunderstorms made life really difficult for the farmers. Hunters and gatherers, they could just migrate to another place that's not so stormy. So you needed to explain exactly why farming was easier for people that knew how to farm, that had agriculture. Maybe someone else might not understand exactly point blank why farming is an easier lifestyle. That's why, even though farming led to all of what you see here, civilization, and the nice life we have today, some people could say that they thought that farming for Neolithic people was harder than what their recent ancestors, the Paleolithic people, had been doing, hunting and gathering. So there you have why you had to really justify using information about Neolithic life, why it probably was an easier lifestyle. Number 5. It would have helped if you had described what else in people's lives in Neolithic times became easier as a result of knowing how to farm. So that it's not just that their farming made their food supply more plentiful and more stable, which basically is one of the biggest answers to why farming made their lives easier than hunting and gathering. But also, because their food supply was stable, what are the many other ways their lives changed? You didn't have to list all of them, but if you included other changes in Neolithic people's lives that were better because of their ability to farm, that's kind of what we were looking for as well. Number 6. Okay, one mistake that was made was referring to either the Paleolithic or the Neolithic people using pronouns and not saying Paleolithic or Neolithic. Avoid using pronouns whenever you're writing about a particular group of people or a person, especially when you're first referring to that group or that person. Don't use a pronoun because we need to know exactly who you're talking about. So that was one thing that if you did that you would try to avoid next time you're writing in time of written response. Number 7. Complete sentences were not used, and you want to make sure that you are completing your thought. It doesn't necessarily mean that a complete sentence, subject, verb, and noun is enough. It means that the thought that you're starting, whatever you were trying to say, that you don't end it prematurely, that you complete the entire thought and bring it full circle. And to do so, usually you have to have a complete sentence, but it's most important that even if you have a complete sentence, technically, that you also have completed that thought in its entirety, and that you didn't assume that I knew what you were talking about, that you said specifically with detail exactly what you meant to say. Number 8. Another thing you want to make sure that you don't do is not give enough information on the Paleolithic or the Neolithic people. Since the question is asking who had an easier lifestyle, the Paleolithic or the Neolithic, and you had to use vocabulary words in your response anyway, you want to make sure that you include plenty of detail about the differences between those two groups of people. You don't have to say everything that was different about the Paleolithic and Neolithic, but in your response, if you were vague in describing the differences or didn't describe very specifically how they were different at all, then that would be something you want to fix whenever you're responding to anything, especially comparing two groups of people, two cultures. You always want to specifically talk about how those two cultures are different by talking about the details of each of the two cultures. Number 9. Did you use vocabulary words in your response? When you're talking about the Paleolithic people, did you use migration? Did you use hunting and gathering? When you're talking about the Neolithic people, did you use agriculture, domesticate? Did you talk about division of labor in your answer? Those would have been great vocabulary words to have included in your answer. Number 10. If you mentioned a difference that would have made Neolithic people's lives a little bit easier than Paleolithic people's lives, but it wasn't the most significant difference, the most significant difference being that Neolithic people knew how to farm, they could grow their own crops, they could raise their own animals, and that controlled their food supply. That's the biggest difference between the Neolithic group of people and the Paleolithic earlier humans who did not know how to do those things. So if you mention something in a response like Neolithic people's lives were easier because their clothes might have been more comfortable and more stylish because they had time to create fancier clothing styles, but you never mentioned agriculture or farming as a Neolithic innovation that the Paleolithic people didn't have, while technically you'd have been correct in talking about the Neolithic people's clothing, but you would have been missing the larger point. So while Neolithic clothing might have been cooler than Paleolithic clothing, that's not really the point for why the Neolithic lives were easier than the Paleolithic lives. Agriculture. That was the difference for the Neolithic people. It's important to mention the most important details or the most significant, meaningful details when you're talking about a group of people, and then you can mention the secondary details that are differences in their lives but aren't as don't have as much of an impact on their lives as, for instance, the food supply, the farming difference, the agriculture that the Neolithic people were able to have, the Paleolithic people didn't. And that's a wrap.